All right, so today we're going to begin, oops, hold on one second here. Just gonna move this. Today we're gonna begin talking about Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. And what you read from the textbook is an excerpt from a much longer essay. The essay is, I believe, like 100 pages, 120 pages. You could read it in a day if you were ambitious. I think it took me like 2 days to read when I was reading it during my first reading it, when I read it for the first time doing my undergrad work. It's an excellent essay. Like, I highly recommend reading the whole thing. If you can get a copy of it, you can find a copy online for sure. But if you want to order a copy on Amazon or whatever, get a little copy of The Myth of Sisyphus. Read it. It's an excellent short essay, and I highly recommend it. We are going to be looking at just actually the very end of the essay. It's not until like the end, at like a page like 110 or something like that in the essay, that Camus actually starts addressing the myth of Sisyphus itself. And that's what's excerpted here. It's the very end of that longer essay. So there's like 100 pages that lead up to the excerpt that you read for today, and it's worth looking at that if you can find the time to do it. It's very rewarding. And one thing that you'll notice if you do that is that Camus is a different kind of philosopher than the sorts of philosophers and philosophy that we've been examining throughout the course so far. Camus is also a novelist, a playwright, a literary figure. He won the Nobel Prize in literature. And the way in which he approaches philosophy is much more concerned with what we call existential questions, questions about life, about death, about love, about political freedom. These are sort of issues which sometimes resist being dealt with only within a theoretical or abstract context. So Camus is very much interested in the question about how we live our lives. How should we live? How should we relate to ourselves, to others, and to the world? Now, I think that the kinds of questions we have covered in this course do lead there eventually. But as you've seen, right, it's difficult to translate some of the theoretical concepts that we've covered in this class so far into practical, real world, everyday circumstances. Now, I mean, that's actually something I'm continually attempting to do. I think good philosophers, really good philosophers, are ones who know how to see the connection between very abstract and theoretical problems and our concrete lived experience. And that's actually, making that connection is what makes philosophy so hard, I think, ultimately, is really being able to embody the issues that we study in philosophy in our lives, which requires a kind of like wisdom to be able to do that, right? And it's the work of a lifetime. It's something I'm continually trying to improve upon. But Camus just dives straight in, right? So he's less interested in doing conceptual, theoretical work, working with syllogisms, with premises and conclusions, right? And it's just kind of more literary, more poetic in his approach. And you see that if you read The Myth of Sisyphus. You even get a little bit of a taste of it here in the little excerpt that we read for today. Okay, so with some of that being said, let's just start looking at it. A bit of a biographical introduction to Camus, because he is an interesting person. He was born in 1913 in Algeria. So notice he's born right before the start of the First World War, which means that he's a young man during the Second World War. In fact, he is living in France at the time of the Nazi occupation of France. And so he's in the thick of it during this period of history. And I mean, even in Algeria, there's the Algerian Revolution, which occurs in the 50s. And Camus, throughout his life, is a politically active figure. And in particular, Camus has a very deep concern and compassion for the ordinary person who is affected by tyranny, by oppression. And Camus fought his whole life to try and like bring a kind of humanity back into the world. It's a large part of his philosophical project is to sort of point out what the human condition is, and then how to face that condition, right? How to exist in the face of what is sometimes a bleak condition. There is a kind of pessimism in Camus because he is writing during a time in which it looks like the world is falling apart. I mean, the world wars are great, catastrophic events. It's hard for us, I think, to sort of recognize the, extent of that, given the relative security that we live in, although we are, of course, currently facing our own world historic challenges at the present moment, a little bit different than the kind of world wars Camus was facing, but nonetheless. So there is a kind of a pessimism which imbues Camus' work, and I think there's a bit of an antidote to this we get in Susan Wolf, who brings a kind of optimism to this question. But we're going to be focusing on this side of it first, because I think it helps lay out what the problem is. So early in his life, he develops a love for literature, theater, and film. So not only is Camus a philosopher, he also wrote books, novellas, plays, which would be performed in the theater, essays, and he did that throughout his life. He also enjoyed soccer for sport and the life lessons it taught him. And there's this little autobiographical comment of his that I like. He writes, "I learned that a ball never arrives from a direction you expected it. And that helped me later in life, especially in mainland France, where nobody plays straight." So as I was mentioning, he was politically active his whole entire life, and was very concerned with the human condition, right? And really understanding what people are like and what the world is like. And when he was young, he briefly joined the Communist Party, but quickly became disillusioned with it. He thought it was far too dogmatic. The Marxist-Leninist brand of communism at the time was a very sort of dogmatic. If you didn't follow the party line, right, you sort of ran afoul of the authorities, and he was not interested in this. He resisted all forms of authoritarianism, whether they were communist or fascist. He was very much not interested in that. Yeah, The Stranger. I mean, The Stranger. So just for what it's worth here, I'll just move through this really quick. The Stranger is the novel that he wrote. Do you consider that a novel or a novella? I don't know. It's short. It's like it's also like 100 pages. It's been a while since I've read it. Sometimes you get to read that in English classes. I think I first read it in an English class, and then you might also encounter it if you take a course in existentialism. But The Stranger was a book he wrote after he had written The Myth of Sisyphus, because it's an attempt to work out what the absurd hero would be like. We're going to be looking at this figure, the absurd hero, and The Stranger was an attempt to fictionalize that philosophical concept that he works out in The Myth of Sisyphus, right? So all of his works, there are through lines between the philosophical essays, the plays, and the novels, and he's working out those ideas in all of them. It's something I wish I sort of had a little more time to do in this class, is just show how philosophy, I don't think, is just confined to sort of theoretical arguments. I also try to show you how it shows up in film, but it, also in literature and in the arts more generally. I don't think there's as hard a distinction as sometimes people make it out to be, or as sometimes philosophers make it out to be, because philosophers tend to like to preserve their status as hard-nosed logical analysts. But nonetheless, I'm digressing. In 1957, he's awarded the Nobel Prize in literature, and he tragically dies in 1960 in a car accident at the young age of 47. So we lost him very early, and who knows what else he would have done if he lived a bit longer. So that's Camus in a nutshell is a more complicated figure than what I presented here, but it gives us a little taste at least. And so this is a hard way to sort of begin the issue. I always hesitate here. I'm always a bit uncertain about how to talk about this, but it leads into Camus' view, and I think it helps motivate where Camus is coming from. So Camus thinks that one of the most important questions that we can ask ourselves, if not the most important question, is whether or not we should continue to live. And he thinks that suicide is a human phenomenon that represents a critical point in the development of the human life. That the question about whether or not one continues to live is a question that requires an answer which can change the way in which we exist in the world, for the better or for the worse. Now, I want to preface this by saying suicide is a very serious issue, right? And I can't give it the necessary space that it really actually does deserve here, because we only have a limited amount of time. But it's not only a very serious issue, it's also a very complex issue. And the reason why somebody might take their life can happen for a number of different reasons. And I don't want to give the impression that this is sort of just an easy problem to think about. It's super complex, and it is not at all easy to think about. And we are not going to be able to go into the complexity that probably the subject actually deserves. But I want to show you why Camus thinks it's important at a very general level, at a very abstract level, and how it exemplifies the kind of approach to philosophy that Camus thinks distinguishes him from sort of other types of more theoretically oriented philosophers. So Camus thinks that the fundamental question of philosophy, that like the most important philosophical question you can ask is life worth living? There's no more important question than that. And he therefore thinks that there's really only one truly serious philosophical problem, which is the problem of suicide. Should I continue to live my life? Right? Is life worth living? The way in which we answer that question determines a lot. Some people lose their lives because of a possible response to this question. And it can be a terrible loss, right? And Camus thinks that the act itself is a philosophical response, right? Like that is the way in which philosophy is concretely embedded in a human life. We can see a response to this question in how somebody responds to the problem of suicide. And while some people lose their lives because of the possible response to a question like this, many people's lives are greatly enhanced by this question. And that's ultimately what Camus thinks, is that by considering this question, our lives can be greatly enhanced. So I'm not trying to advocate any sort of morbid state of mind here, right? But I do want to try and show you why Camus thinks at least considering this question could be transformative. Camus thinks that in an individual life, there's going to be a moment in which this question is raised. And the way in which one responds to that, there are different ways in which one can respond to it, but that question has the potential for being a turning point in the life of an individual. So it's a deep philosophical problem that is really only met by the way in which we live our lives, by how we decide to live. And he wants to distinguish a question like this from just a theoretical problem that we could consider for an hour and a half on a Monday morning and then never have to think about again. He thinks that many philosophical problems are kind of games, right? They're sort of puzzles, and this is largely the way in which philosophy is taught in school, right? In the Western academies, is as kind of theoretical puzzles that you should, be clever about and think about. Camus doesn't think philosophy is that's really what ultimately philosophy should be doing. He thinks that philosophy should be dealing with essential problems, and these are problems that run the risk of leading either to death, right, a mortal question, or leading to an intensification of the passion of life. So for Camus, essential problems are problems that a lot rides on. How we experience our lives, right, on these sorts of questions. And we are all encountering them or grappling with them, even if we're not aware that that's what we're doing. He writes, in a sense, and as in melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It's a response to the problem of human life. It is confessing that life is too much for you or that you do not understand it. So again, Camus thinks these sorts of problems are problems that are answered in the way in which we live our lives. And a part of what we're going to try to come to grips with today is how Camus thinks we should come to respond to the question about whether or not life has meaning, right? And that's going to be the theme we cover for the rest of the course. Again, things are, it's tough to talk about this subject in particular. And again, I've done it very quickly here. And the question of suicide is a very deep and complex question. Hopefully, though, this motivates sort of where Camus is coming from and why he thinks this really does matter. Okay, so what does the myth of Sisyphus have to do with this? Well, again, the myth of Sisyphus is only mentioned by Camus at the very end of this long essay, and it's meant to exemplify some of the themes that he deals with, or the themes he deals with in the essay leading up to it. So again, I recommend reading that if you get a chance. But we're going to just dive straight into the myth. So who is Sisyphus? Sisyphus is a figure from Greek mythology, right? And Sisyphus in the myths is punished for defying the gods. There are several different stories about why he was punished. The one that I find a bit humorous is the one where he's on his deathbed, right? And I don't know, the Greeks were weird. And he says to his wife, when I die, I want you to throw my body into the public square. Now, doing that is like one of the worst things you can do, right? Giving the dead a proper burial is one of the most important values in ancient Greek culture. And he's asking his wife to essentially commit the sacrilegious act. And what he's thinking is, oh, this is going to be a test to see whether or not she really loves me, whether or not she's really faithful. If she does what I say, what I've asked her to do, that will show she's not actually faithful, right? She doesn't actually love me. But if she doesn't do what I tell her, then that will be confirmation that she does love me. So sort of a weird twisted logic there. But so Sisyphus dies, and he goes to the underworld, right? As you do in the Greek world. And his wife throws his body into the public square and doesn't give him a proper burial as he asked her to do. And she says, I knew it, right? I knew it all along. And so Sisyphus then goes to Hades, the lord of the underworld, right? The king of the underworld, and says, hey, look what my wife has done. I haven't had a proper burial. I need to go back up to the normal world, the world of human beings, and make sure my body is properly buried. If you let me do that, I'll come right back down and get back to my place here in the underworld. And so Hades says, okay, you get to go. And Sisyphus goes back up to the world, does the burial thing, gets that settled. But then it's like, hey, it's kind of nice up here. I kind of like the fresh air. I kind of like the clear blue sky. I like living my life, eating food, making merry, so on and so forth. And he says, I don't know if I want to go back down there to the underworld. And so he decides against it, right? And he keeps on living his life. Of course, essentially what he's done is like violated something like a natural law. And so all of the signs and portents are being shown to him, right? The gods are angry with him, and he just keeps ignoring it and sort of pushing it out of mind, continually wanting to engage life. Eventually, Mercury comes along. Mercury's the messenger. He goes back and forth from the underworld, and he takes Sisyphus back down to the underworld, and the gods punish him for defying death, or for trying to escape death, by ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain. Oops. So that's the punishment. And it's not a rock really, it's more like a boulder. So there's the picture there, the artistic rendering of Sisyphus. You can see that huge boulder, and he is condemned to ceaselessly rolling that rock to a top of a mountain. And then once he reaches the top, the boulder will then fall back to the bottom of the mountain by its own weight, and Sisyphus has to push the boulder back up over and over again for eternity. Right, so you get the idea of the punishment here. He has to roll this huge boulder up to the top of the mountain, gets it to the top, watch it rolls back down, and then he has to do this over and over again for eternity. Yeah, that's the punishment. So I guess the first question here is, why this punishment in particular? What's so bad about having to roll a boulder up a mountain, watch it roll back down, and then do it again over and over again for eternity? I mean, why is Sisyphus given this punishment as opposed to some other? And what is ultimately so bad about this punishment? I mean, at least he's doing something, I suppose, right? So what's going on here? I mean, the ancient Greek myths, right? They're deeper than just their surface level meaning. And they point to some other, condition about human life, which is trying to be explained. So why is this punishment given to Sisyphus? What do you think?
It's busy work.
It's busy work. Okay. Yeah. So what's so bad about busy work?
It's not fulfilling. It's useless work.
It's useless. It's pointless, right? Like you're just doing it to fill time. Busy work, right? It's just work that you're given so as to occupy your time.
Yeah.
There are many sort of ordinary jobs, right? That probably a lot of us have had to work. I mean, I've worked in coffee shops and retail for a number of years too. So hey, I feel it can be a struggle, just doing that same thing day in and day out, and not feeling like you're ultimately doing anything for anything else, right? That there's sort of no purpose or point to the activity. Yeah. So why, I don't know, just real quick, we'll try and see if we can make the connection here. Why is that the kind of punishment it's not just being caught in a mental loop. It's not being caught in a mental loop, right? I mean, it's like literally being engaged in an act which doesn't seem to have any further purpose, right? It's not just thinking about it, it's doing the thing, right? Living in a way which seems to be devoid of ultimate meaning or significance. And why is that the punishment that's given for trying to escape death? Are there any thoughts about, I mean, so I at least want to put that out on the table. And I don't even know if it's something that I fully worked out yet, but why is this punishment the one you get for trying to live forever, for trying to cheat death? You get this punishment of a pointless, meaningless task. Yeah, so you're like saying, hey, there's this like point in which it seems like you're going to achieve something, right? I mean, first of all, how can you even put the effort into pushing the boulder up the mountain without some like sense like, I need to get it there, right? Like, I've got to get the boulder to the top. I mean, it seems like, hey, isn't that a purpose? Isn't that a kind of a point, right? Doesn't that in some sense make the task meaningful? Because if I just get it to the top of the mountain, then maybe it'll be done. Maybe I'll have achieved the purpose or the point. The problem is once he gets it to the top and it seems like, yes, it rolls back down and he has to do it again. And so then you're like, wait a second, that whole cycle of striving, of ambition, of wanting to achieve the point or the purpose, it has to be felt. I can't help but want to achieve this thing. And yet the achievement of that task its purpose is completely annihilated in the repetition of the task over and over and over again for eternity. Yeah. So it's like almost being there and then just being sucked right back into the striving and the wanting and the desiring, the achievement, right back into the over and over and over again. And then you think about that for a minute, and you go, wait a second, it never ends. That's not right. It's the same task over and over again forever. The mail doesn't stop, right? So that's a little terrifying, right? The task that Sisyphus is given is pointless. It doesn't have a purpose. It doesn't lead anywhere. It seems completely meaningless. Now, as mortal beings, right, we all strive for meaning and purpose. I don't know if we can get around that. If we are awake, and I mean, even at the most minimal level, we've got to strive to survive, right? I mean, and then, if you live in a culture in which most of your survival needs are taken care of already, then like these problems pop up in other areas, right? Like, what kind of life am I going to live? What's my profession? There's all sorts of things, all sorts of questions we have to ask ourselves, and a seriousness with which we have to take our lives. And we tend to think that it does have meaning and purpose. I mean, that's how we continue to move forward. And to be denied meaning and purpose in life seems like a great tragedy. I mean, ultimately, if the question, is life worth living, is answered in the negative, it's sad. I mean, that's a depressing state of affairs, right? To not be able to find meaning and purpose in what one does is that's rough.
So it's kind of like the meaning is pointless just because he's just going to be doing it forever. There's never anything to look forward to. It's just,
yeah. So well, yeah, sorry, go ahead, finish.
Like normally whenever there's like a hard task, you're like, oh, after this I can do whatever I want. But for him, it's just after this, there's more of this. It
Right.
seems kind of just like hopeless,
Right. So, I mean, you think, if once I finish writing this philosophy paper, I can go and play Call of Duty or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And that at least seems like a kind of reward. I did the hard thing. I can go have some fun now. But then, like, the hellish nightmare, which is being considered here, is you just have to write your philosophy papers over and over again for eternity, right? And you don't get to, go play Call of Duty or something like that. And it's that repetition of the same task over and over again, which sucks the meaning out of it. Because you'd think, I mean, what would we have to say about? I see a couple of questions there. I was going to ask this one question, and then I'll get to those. What would we have to say about Sisyphus's condition to, like, what would we tweak about his condition to make it meaningful? Actually, hold on that question for a minute. I want to take the questions, the comments or questions first, but then keep this in the back of your head. What would we have to do about Sisyphus's condition? What would we have to tweak in the scenario here in order to think about his life as meaningful?
The whole thing just reminded me of our daily life. During the day, we all working in a hope to reach something, and during the night we sleep, and next day we will start it all over again, like just Sisyphus, that he will actually bringing the rock on the top, and then there will be a pause. The rock comes back at the bottom of the mountain, and then he will start it all over again. It just reminded me of that thing.
Yes, and that is that's Camus' point. That's what Camus wants you to be thinking about here. That's what he thinks the case of Sisyphus represents, is precisely that condition that we all every day find ourselves in. We'll have to work that out a little bit further and figure out why, though, exactly. But you're entirely on track with that.
Yeah, I think that, like, I completely agree with this slide, that, like, purpose is what gives us hope and motivation. And, like, to add on to that, I think that's exactly where the problem of existential crisis is. Like, people think that, like, what's the purpose of life if we think about it? Like, we all work hard to, like, achieve wealth and fame and fortune, but, like, we're just gonna die anyways. It's like as if our existence is just, like, so small compared to this universe. I think that's the fear of existential crisis, right?
Yeah. I mean,
It's pretty terrifying.
There's an analog here in the question about our own mortality. So we all know we're going to die, right? But how many of us have actually had an existential realization of the fact? I think that's much rarer, right? It actually took me a long time to come to, because I've been studying philosophy for quite a while now. And, the question of mortality is always sort of there, but I never sort of really felt myself, like, I never felt a total concern with that until a particular point in which I think the question was really brought home. And I'm not even sure I still fully understand it, but because we're talking about this when we're talking about personal identity. How can you conceptualize the end of the entire world? I mean, what does that even mean? It's hard to really come to terms with the absolute loss that is involved in death. And you'd think that when that realization occurs, it can cause you to see your own life in a different light. And the kind of scenario that Camus is having us considered is much like this question about mortality. What do I do in the face of the inevitable fact of the end of my world? there's a similar question here. How do we respond to that situation? You might take the end of your world as something which is to be feared, or something to despair about, right? Something which makes life seem meaningless or less significant because it's all going to be taken away anyways. But then on the other hand, there also seems to be a kind of deep realization that comes with the recognition of one's morality. And in fact, a lot of the ancient philosophical traditions that you find in pre-Socratics, but even in Plato and the Stoic philosophers and the Cynics, are geared toward a recognition of one's own death, a kind of practice built around such a recognition, because it seems to somehow improve life. So there's kind of a double-edged sword there. On the one hand, it can lead to despair. On the other hand, it seems to also have the potential for transforming life for the better, whatever that means exactly. And we're being led in Camus here in this essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, to contemplate a very similar notion. It's not the notion of our own death, but it's the notion about whether or not life contains a meaning or a purpose or a point. That's the question we're being asked to meditate upon. Ultimately, Camus is going to say it doesn't. There is no point. There is no purpose to life. And yet, meditating on that fact for Camus is intended to be transformative. So we'll try and work that out a little bit further here. Real quick, I wanted to come back to this idea, though, of Sisyphus's task as just the repetition of it, the fact that it continues forever and that there's no ultimate endpoint, right? There's no ultimate fulfillment of it, seems to take the meaning or the significance out of it. So what might you change if we could just change the myth? What would you change in order to make Sisyphus's task at least seem meaningful? What might you change about it?
It needs to have a purpose and possibly a reward.
Right.
Maybe if you get the boulder on top of the hill, then you could go back to the real world. Like you could live your life again, something like that.
Yeah, right. So like if he could just push the boulder to the top of the mountain, maybe he has to do it several times, but maybe he's building like a temple on top of the mountain. And at some point, the temple will be complete and will be finished. That at least gives the appearance of making the task seem meaningful. What's being pointed out to us in the way in which the myth is represented is the conditions that make it clearly not meaningful or pointless. Now, ultimately, what Camus is going to say is that even if we think there's some point or some meaning, we're going to be somewhat deluded about that. Right, some kind of explicit progress would need to be present in order for that to at least seem meaningful. At least it seems that way. And his attitude to the task is going to be the relevant feature here, but we're going to see that come in just a little bit. So when you say that, Andrew, it's not, so this is, I think, a very difficult question with Camus is, does the change in attitude actually make the task meaningful? Can it do that? That's a puzzling question that we're not there yet, so I'm jumping ahead. Let me just pause on that and we'll get to it in just a minute. Or we'll pick it up next time if we don't have time here. Okay, so here's another quote. You have already grasped that Sisyphus is the absurd hero. Okay, so this is a big issue we have to come to terms with. Why is Sisyphus a hero? And why is he an absurd hero? Okay, so Camus is saying he is the hero of the story. He is as much through his passions as through his torture. His scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted towards accomplishing nothing. This is the price that must be paid for the passions of this earth. So again, you can sort of start to get the flavor of the poetry of Camus here. It's nice. And the final, so we've got to figure out why Sisyphus is the absurd hero. We need to come to terms with that. And the final task that Camus sets up in the essay is the challenge he gives us is to imagine Sisyphus happy. Now, this isn't us just saying, oh, he's happy. I mean, we can't just say that. We really need to come to an understanding of how it could be possible for Sisyphus to be happy in his condition. Yeah. So let's spend a moment on this notion of Sisyphus as the absurd hero. So as a hero, albeit an absurd one, Sisyphus is a template or an archetype that serves as a mirror for understanding ourselves. So what does that mean for Sisyphus to be an archetype? That's really a term which was popularized by the psychiatrist Carl Jung. And it's the idea that, figures in mythology represent a kind of schematic of human behavior, a kind of a way in which we can understand our own condition. And, of course, the myths, if you just take them as like attempting to be sort of factual stories, they seem absurd, but, you're misunderstanding the myth if you read them that way. Myths are designed to reveal to us something deeper about ourselves, and they require a kind of interpretation or a decipherment in order for that deeper existential layer of the myths to become apparent. And so if Sisyphus is a hero, what are heroes? Heroes are kind of templates of human behavior. They often represent what is possible for us to attain. I mean, even in the ancient Greek world, the local city-states were founded on hero cults, right? You had some local hero who was the founder of the city. And people would look to that hero as a kind of a magical presence, but it would be a way of understanding how to relate to life, how to relate to the world. So Sisyphus is being held up here as a kind of a mirror of ourselves and as a possible roadmap for how we might live our own lives. So the question then, and I think we've already gotten we've actually nailed this already, but will be useful to go over it again. In what way are we like Sisyphus? So what do we see of ourselves represented in the life of Sisyphus? What is Sisyphus showing us about ourselves? So Sisyphus is rolling the boulder up the mountain, watching it roll back down for eternity, right? And he can't help but do that, right? So how is that similar to our condition? That boulder going up, boulder going down. How is that like?
Humans are driven by purpose.
Yeah, driven by purpose. And yet, like Sisyphus, that purpose always seems.
Yeah, I think like the falling boulder like symbolizes that, like maybe since Camus looks at it from like a pessimistic view, it symbolizes that, like once we die, it really doesn't mean anything. After accomplishing so many achievements, in the end, we all die. So
yeah. So the purpose is sort of cut short, right? It's just it always eludes us. We want it, but it always eludes us. It is always just there on the horizon, just within reach. And right when we think we have it, it's gone and we start over again. That's the kind of powerlessness that we ourselves experience, and which is represented in the myth of Sisyphus. Yeah, the world's out. We'll get to that. And now most of us though, so I mean, how often do we think about this, right? We all, I think, go about our lives with a relative degree of unconsciousness. I mean, if you were always thinking about this, it would be tough, right? You have to kind of forget and become unconscious of the fact that a lot of what we do is just based entirely on habit. It's based entirely on custom and habit. And if we were really to become conscious of why we're doing what we're doing, we would see that the reasons that we act upon ultimately don't satisfy the actions that we undertake. Yeah, that we have certain ways of lulling ourselves into sleep in order to avoid the question, right? In order to put it aside, because becoming conscious of this purposelessness is uncomfortable. And so we remain in a kind of sleep and unconsciousness. And I think, it's perfectly natural to do this, right? That in some sense allows us to continue on. We do the same things over and over again without knowing exactly why, without a sense of what it all means. I mean, when we have that question, we might either just be so baffled by the scope of it that we say, hey, the question is meaningless and let's not even think about it anymore. Or it might just be terrifying. And we might try and forget about it by just going back to our customs and our routines, because those provide a kind of an answer in the way in which we just go, we can wake up in the morning, brush your teeth, go to work, come home, watch TV, be entertained, go to sleep, wake up, do it again, right? And we do that day in and day out. And oftentimes we're just, we're just unconscious. We're not thinking about it explicitly. We just do it, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but this is kind of like the condition of Sisyphus, just rolling the boulder up and down, up, down, up, down, up, down. Like being on a treadmill, right? Or hamster wheel. And we're like that, according to Camus. That's what Sisyphus is showing us about ourselves, is that like what we do, no matter what it is we're doing, we might be living happy and productive lives. But we're like Sisyphus. If we were to really stop and think about it, we'd see that that's our condition. All of us. No matter what, no matter how wealthy you are, no matter how happy you are, no matter how depressed you are, right? This is for everyone. According to Camus, this is human. This is the human condition. And so this unconsciousness is in some sense necessary in order to cope with the situation. So long passage here, but again, I just really like the prose poetry of Camus. So I'm going to read some of it, and there's a really important point here. So we got an aspect of the powerlessness, right, of Sisyphus, which is showing us our own kind of powerlessness, our unconsciousness, and our willingness to just do the same thing over and over again without knowing why we're doing it. That's part of the condition being represented to us in the myth of Sisyphus. One sees merely the whole effort of a body straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it and push it up a slope 100 times over. One sees the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the clay-covered mass, the foot wedging it, the fresh start with arms outstretched, the wholly human security of two earth-clotted hands. The very end of his long effort measured by skyless space and time without depth, the purpose is achieved. Then Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments towards the lower world, whence he will have to push it up again towards the summit. He goes back down to the plain. Okay, so I think it's a really nice description. And now Camus is having us focus on a particular moment here. The moment is the moment in which Sisyphus watches the boulder roll back down the mountain. The purpose is achieved, the seeming purpose, right? He gets it to the top, and now Camus really wants to focus on this moment of the boulder rolling back down to the bottom. He writes, it's during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. So this is really the key moment for Camus. It's the critical moment. And so it's not just going to be the powerlessness of Sisyphus. Like, that's not just it. That's not the only dimension we need to be focusing on here. It's this dimension here, which actually brings in at least the basic conditions for absurd heroism to become possible. Okay, so he writes, it's during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. That hour, like a breathing space which returns as surely as his suffering, that is the hour of consciousness. At each of those moments, when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks towards the layers of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. So what's going on here? What's happening when Sisyphus, he gets the boulder to the top of the mountain, and there's this moment, right? This breath. Oh, finally the semester is over. You get this breath, right? Winter break. Finally, it's over again. It's over. He gets to the top. The purpose is accomplished. It rolls back down to the plain. What is Camus interested in here? Why is this moment important? He says there's this pause, right? This breathing space. And he says that hour, like a breathing space, which returns as surely as his suffering. Right? Pushing the boulder up, oh, it's toil and trouble. And then it rolls back down. And you've got to think at least there's going to be a sigh of relief for a moment. I actually imagine Sisyphus like joyous and ecstatic while he's watching the boulder is coming back down to the bottom. But that's not it, right? That's not all. It's not just a satisfaction. In fact, can Sisyphus be satisfied? So there's something else going on in this moment in which he gets to stop and in which it seems like satisfaction is present. He says that is the hour of consciousness. What does he mean by that?
If he reaches his goal, he doesn't have anything to do after that, I think. He will, if he reaches his goal, he doesn't have anything to do after that. So he needs that hope, I think, to reach his next goal.
But isn't the terribleness
he needs that hope, I think. He needs that hope to actually to be able to continue, I think.
He needs the hope. So, but once he gets to the top, he's watching it roll back down. What is he thinking about? I mean, you might say, well, because he's done that one task, but he knows it's going to repeat eternally, right?
Or maybe he wants to be rebellious. He wants to prove to himself that he's stronger than what the fate, what is his fate? I don't know.
Yeah, so I want to just make sure we clarify that first part, because there's no ultimate goal which has been satisfied. And you might think it's that hope that like, oh, eventually it'll be done, right? Eventually I'll be finished with this. which maybe sustains him and keeps him going. Eventually, he's got eternity here, so he's going to at some point recognize it's never going to be done, right? That's never going to happen. The hope is an illusion. That's not going to happen. And nonetheless, when he gets the boulder to the top of the mountain, there's going to be some moment of satisfaction. There's a breathing space there. But what does he recognize in that moment? He says, Camus says it's the hour of consciousness.
Maybe he can choose whether he continue to climb down and start it again, or he just quit.
He can't quit, though. I mean, his punishment is to do it forever. He can't just quit. I mean, that's the punishment we said earlier, that quote, this is the punishment he pays for the passion of living, is the perpetual striving towards fulfillment and it never coming. So it's not, I mean, when it comes to the human condition, Camus thinks there is the option of opting out. That's one response to the problem. But the response that Camus advocates for is continuing, even despite of the condition that we recognize here. And it's the hour of consciousness. That's what Camus is interested in here. Before, we were comparing what Sisyphus's condition is like to our own, in the sense that we are engaged in this continual pursuit of meaning and purpose, and it always eludes us. And yet we pointed out that, well, largely we're unconscious. We don't think about this, just like we don't usually think about our own death, right? Because it's kind of too much to think about. Now, when the boulder is rolling back down to the bottom of the mountain, suddenly Sisyphus has an opportunity to think about his condition. That's why it's the hour of consciousness, because it's only when the boulder's rolling back down to the bottom of the plane that he can cognize, that he can become aware of what his condition is. When he's pushing the boulder up the mountain, he's just engaged, right? You're just engaged in pushing the boulder. And there is some kind of meaning in that, in some sense, when you're doing it, right? Because there's this purpose or this point which is driving you to complete the task. Now, the problem comes when the task is completed. And now there's the moment of consciousness, the realization, oh, this is just going to repeat itself for eternity. This is going to just continue. It's going to always be like this. I'm going to push. I'm going to have a moment of satisfaction, and then I'm going to be right back in it, doing it again. That's the awareness that he's coming to in this moment. At each of those moments, when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks towards the layers of the gods, this is the trick here. He says he's superior to his fate. What? What is going on with that? Why is he superior to his fate? Why does this consciousness afford him the opportunity to be superior to his fate, to be stronger than his rock? His fate belongs to him. That's interesting.
Maybe
Silence.
he's superior to his fate because, like, the gods plan to, like, torture him, but at every moment he at least gets that tiny satisfaction, even if it means nothing.
It's not the
in the end.
It's not the satisfaction. I mean, I think so, at least. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think it's the satisfaction. That's not what Camus is interested in. There's the little bit of satisfaction, but that's illusory, because immediately he then recognizes, oh, I'm just going to do it over and over again. What makes him superior, I think, is that now he understands. Now he knows his condition. And knowing his condition now gives him a choice. He's now not just unconsciously laboring, pushing the rock up and down over and over and over again. He's recognized, the condition is now clear to him. Hey, this is it. There's no purpose or meaning in my task, and this is going to continue for eternity. He's now conscious of this. Camus calls this, he uses the term lucidity to describe the state of mind, lucidity. This just kind of clear, crystal clear understanding of the condition. And that understanding is an expansion of consciousness, and one which gives Sisyphus a choice. And in some sense, it gives him freedom, a limited kind of freedom, albeit, but a kind of freedom. And it provides the opportunity for absurd heroism. Right? So we're running out of time here, but just trying to make the case, life requires a certain amount of sleep and inattentiveness to many of the realities taking place around us. But every once in a while, we awake. We become aware of what's happening. And that is what Camus is calling the hour of consciousness. When we suddenly become aware of our own condition, that is a kind of awakening. And this awareness, according to Camus, on the one hand, it brings with it a sense of alienation. So it's not just a satisfaction at the top of the mountain that Sisyphus has, right? That satisfaction is in some sense illusory. It's really not the point. The point is that now Sisyphus is going to say, why the heck? I can't believe I have to continue to do this. I was like trying to push the boulder up to the top of the mountain, and it felt like once I got there, it'd be complete. But then now I see that's not true. It doesn't make the framework I was using to understand life and reality no longer makes sense now that I'm aware of the actual conditions. Right? So this lucidity, this awareness, this awakening is alienating, right? It actually sort of tears us away from the way in which we normally engage with the world. It makes us feel foreign to ourselves. And that's a tough moment. But for Camus, this also carries with it the possibility of a kind of redemption. An absurd redemption appropriate for an absurd hero. Now, our question is going to be, so first of all, you can see it's a double-edged sword, right? The awakening, it brings with it a kind of alienation. It's not necessarily fun, right? It's not necessarily a pleasant realization. But then at the very same time, it brings with it the possibility of a certain kind of redemption, a certain kind of freedom, and at least I think a certain kind of meaning and purpose, even though it's not the way in which we normally think about meaning and purpose. So let me go through this quote here. This is from the longer essay. A couple of these quotes are, and it just illustrates the point we're going over here. It happens that the stage sets collapse, right? So the theater production, right? Suddenly you realize that it's a play and reality is occurring behind that in some sense. So it's the awakening he's talking about. It happens that the stage sets collapse. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed out most of the time. That's that kind of unconsciousness and habit that we all, have to sort of necessarily be a part of. But one day the why arises and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. Okay, so another really potent phrase here, weariness tinged with amazement. Weariness comes at the end of the acts of a mechanical life, delivering the mail over and over and over and over again. But at the same time, it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness. It awakens consciousness and provokes what follows. What follows is the gradual return into the chain that sort of unconscious absorption into the everyday activity, or it is the definitive awakening. At the end of the awakening comes in time the consequence, suicide or recovery, a double-edged sword. So what Camus is then pointing to in this moment, this is the crucial moment of the myth in which Sisyphus is watching the boulder roll back down, and he has the moment of recognition. That's the weariness tinged with amazement. It comes at the end of the acts of mechanical life, but it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness. He is aware. He is awake to his condition. And that awakening now provides the opportunity for a further response. What do we do once that awakening occurs? And so there's really two moments, right? The moment is, there's really two steps here. There's the step to the awakening, which is the most basic. And when I say basic, I think sort of the fundamental moment is awaking to the fact, right? Which, I mean, it could take a long time for a life to actually reach the moment in which that consciousness is engendered. Once it is engendered, though, there is then a choice which has to be made, according to Camus. How do we deal with it? What do we do once we recognize that there is no purpose or meaning in life, but we will continually be pursuing purpose and meaning? What do we do when we face that moment? He writes, if this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. Where would his torture be indeed if at every step the hope of succeeding him upheld him, right? So that was the idea brought up a moment ago, was that it's his hope which could uphold him. But where would the torture be in that? I mean, where would the punishment be in that? If he could just keep hoping, that at least would sustain him. It would be a kind of useful illusion to help mitigate the unpleasantness of the actual condition. What's tragic, according to Camus, is that Sisyphus knows his condition. He's aware of it. So Camus continues, the workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and his fate is no less absurd, right? So this is the fate of all of us. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. I mean, that's where it really acutely becomes a problem. It's not a problem if we can be upheld by illusions, if we can be upheld by that kind of unconsciousness. It becomes a problem when we can't help but be aware of it. Then it requires something of us. Then we're forced to make a choice about what to do in the face of it. So we want to get clear on what the absurd hero is becoming conscious of. What exactly is the absurd hero becoming conscious of? Here's a quote from the longer essay. It's not in your excerpt, but it starts to, Camus is here attempting to articulate the philosophical notion of the absurd. So it begins very abstract. He writes, the feeling of absurdity springs from a comparison. The feeling of absurdity does not spring from the mere scrutiny of a fact or an impression. It bursts from the comparison between a bare fact and a certain reality, between an action and the world that transcends it. The absurd is essentially a divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation. It's born of their confrontation. So he's saying the feeling of absurdity springs from a comparison. It springs from a confrontation between two facts. Yeah. Now, Camus wants to say, hey, the absurd, right? This is a philosophical concept for Camus. And we want to try and be precise about it. And he's saying that the feeling of it, we get its sense, we sense it. We sense its presence when there is a confrontation between two facts. And I'm trying to get us to think about what are those two facts that are confronting each other when this feeling of absurdity arises in the human case.
I guess a confrontation between our personal purpose, or like what gives us satisfaction, versus the harsh reality that essentially it's meaningless.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's not even just I mean, the way you phrase that, it makes it sound like we all have our individual purpose. I mean, and you might think like in the case of the passing of the butter, maybe there is some kind of purpose like that, but it's not, it doesn't seem, there's no purpose to the universe, right? There's no purpose to the universe. And when we have a feeling that our actions are purposeful, that there is some point to it all, some overarching meaning, which is going to make sense of it all in the end. And and that's the subjective feeling of meaning that we're talking about here. Say, well, that's meaningful for you. That's meaningful for you. What are we talking about? We're talking about the psychological sense of meaning, right? The subjective sense of meaningfulness. And Camus saying, hey, that's a fact. It's a fact about you, that you feel like some things are meaningful and some things aren't meaningful, and that you try to attain meaning. That's a fact about human beings, right? We try to do what we think is meaningful and significant. Now, that confronts what Camus will say is the indifferent silence of the universe. So this is the way we're built, for whatever reason. Yeah. Maybe if there were God had a sense of humor to build us in such a way that we desire meaning. We aspire to it. We can't help but aspire to meaning and significance. But the world is such that it will never deliver meaning or significance. That's the confrontation. It's a conflict between the self and the world. The absurd is the product of a collision between the human desire for meaning and purpose and what Camus refers to as the indifferent silence of the universe. That's the problem, right? Is that we're built in a way that we have to continue to pursue meaning and purpose, just like Sisyphus has to continue to roll the boulder up the mountain. But then when we step back and we reflect on it, we see there's no purpose or meaning in it. It's ironical, right? It's absurd. So absurd is a technical concept. Absurdity is a technical term for Camus. I mean, when you think about the situation, you go, I mean, what kind of joke is this? I want things to be meaningful. I can't help but take things as meaningful, and yet nothing is meaningful or purposeful in the larger sense. It's absurd. And this is what Camus wants us to become conscious of, and not just to think about it like, and then dust it off, put it away in the closet, maybe dust it off every couple of years and take a look at it, but to keep it continually in the forefront of our mind, that this is our condition. That's what he's asking, right? It's a huge existential ask to be aware of this in the way that Camus is saying he wants us to be aware of this. I mean, because most of us, we're going to forget about it, right? We're not going to keep this in the forefront of our minds because, man, that's tough, right? But Camus thinks it requires a continual effort, and we'll get there in just a moment. Okay, so according to Camus, the core desires and aspirations of the self are fundamentally at odds with the nature of the world. So Camus thinks, look, we have this desire, this aspiration for meaning and purpose, but that is continually at odds with the nature of the world. While the subject strives for knowledge, purpose, and meaning in life, the world itself never delivers this, right? It's like the Igmer's basketball example, or any of the other examples we've been talking about, where You do the thing, you complete the project, and then suddenly the question's still there. But what was the purpose? What was the point? The world isn't human, and Camus thinks we've got to recognize this. The world is not human. It doesn't have to conform to our rational aspirations, whether for knowledge. I mean, knowledge is, in some sense, it is a very human kind of pursuit. Like, we want to know about the world. But why should we think that the world is going to conform to our desire for knowledge? I mean, there might be things about the cosmos that we will never be able to know, right? We are kind of arrogant in our presumption that everything about the universe could potentially be known by us. But that's a very anthropocentric way of conceiving of our situation. Like, why should reality conform to our desire for knowledge? And likewise, why should the world conform to our desire for meaning in our lives? I mean, that's the world. The world itself is not human. It's indifferent to whether or not you live a meaningful life. The world doesn't care about your purpose or your point in existing, right? This is the silent indifference of the universe that Camus is talking about. So the world doesn't contain a human or either a divine purpose, according to Camus. It has no intrinsic meaning. If this is depressing, we are going to look at Susan Wolf's paper, and Susan Wolf is going to sort of object to this picture of things. She's more optimistic about achieving meaning in life. So we are here. I'm not trying to just like preach to you as if this were something that you can't possibly raise an objection to, because you certainly can. In fact, in a class like this, I've always wanted to be able to spend more time thinking about theology, because I think there is some room for the divine here, some conception of the divine. I haven't been able to articulate it fully yet, and I don't know how to do it actually. So Camus' thought, though, here is that when you say, "Hey, look, what gives meaning to life is God," and how do you know God exists? Well, you have to have faith, right? You just have to believe. And Camus calls this philosophical suicide, because he thinks that this is a way of opting out of having to acknowledge the absurd. So he distinguishes that from suicide in the sense of taking one's own life. He calls this philosophical suicide, where we try to get out of the problem that way by positing some kind of infinite beyond, always just sort of out of reach, but we keep striving towards it. And Camus thinks, hey, it's a kind of a way of being dishonest with oneself. It's kind of a way of being in bad faith towards the universe itself, because you're not acknowledging reality. It's a way of it's a way of being able to avoid reality, because the world doesn't have any meaning, and we can't help but think it does. And it's the awareness of this fact, of the comparison, of this conflict or confrontation, that the absurd is constituted by. He writes, at this point of his effort, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born out of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Yeah. So that's the absurd. And it can seem a little depressing, right? And Camus is saying, hey, we need to be aware of this. We need to keep this in the forefront of our minds. So let me just open up the question here. It's a big question. So, respond to it in whatever way you'd like. Is Camus correct about our condition? Is he correct that our condition is absurd in the way that he's described it so far? Do you think that's a good way of describing what's going on? Do you think it's accurate? Yeah, okay, so would he be a nihilist? This is precisely the question that, we need to deal with, because nihilism is the position that nothing has meaning, right? That life, the universe, is meaningless. And Camus, in some sense, in that sense, he is something of a nihilist, but the nihilist position is often to just kind of throw up your hands and say, well, it doesn't matter, like nothing matters, right? But Camus thinks the response to the situation is more profound than that. And we'll see, you know, I tried to bring this in earlier. I'm gonna get to the questions in just a minute. I tried to bring this in earlier that Camus actually sees a way here, a way to live. Remember, Sisyphus is the absurd hero. And the challenge that Camus gives us is to imagine Sisyphus happy. That's what we have to try and figure out. And that is going to be Camus' antidote to nihilism, the way to respond to a meaningless universe. Okay, so we're going to still have to work out what that is. So
I think Camus is correct about our condition. That's, I mean, like, that's, I don't want to say it's a fact, but like, that's the reality. But I think we don't have to live in this like pessimism and like depressing state. Like, we have to like learn to live in the moment and be grateful about every second of our life.
yes, yes, and I think Camus agrees with you at that point. And yeah, I don't want to be too superficial about this. I mean, sometimes we bandy about like being present in the moment. There's a deep truth to that, though. I mean, there's a deep truth to waking up to the absurd condition of the world, which actually allows us to be present to things in a way in which we're not trying to overlay them with our superficial psychological concepts, which seem satisfying to us. You know, kind of like the way we were talking about with the example of the essential worker, how that kind of provided a lot of people with a way of just kind of superficially or performatively acknowledging the importance of that work, right? It's almost worse in a way, right? Because you're giving it this lip service, and then you're not actually attending to the reality of the situation. And Camus thinks that when we recognize the absurd, when we really confront it, suddenly we're present with the world. We're not, our vision isn't clouded by delusion and false hope, but a kind of a genuine presence in the world. Yeah, that's what Sisyphus needs to, I mean, Sisyphus has to be present with his rock in full consciousness and full awareness, and to not try and get out of it, right? To not try and run away from it, but to say, hey, this is it. And suddenly in that moment, when you can say, this is it, we'll see some beautiful passages from Camus. I mean, just read through it. I mean, there's some beautiful passages there where suddenly one's vision is transformed. When you're finally able to be with reality without all of the psychological overlays and illusions and false hopes. Let's get there. Yeah.
I definitely agree with your explanation. Like, I just want to add that sometimes like thinking too much about the future and thinking about like our ultimate purpose, it makes us forget to live in the moment, in the present, which is actually what matters in reality.
Yeah.
Like living in the present instead of thinking too much about the future, basically.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, because oftentimes what are we doing when we're thinking? I mean, I'm not suggesting to all of you that you ought not to think about your future. I mean, this is, and especially at a lot of your stages in life, I mean, planning out what you're going to be doing is really important. But there is a way in which we can obsess with that, right? And be so obsessed with like, oh, it's gotta be this way in order for things to be meaningful, in order for me to meet the expectations that people have of me, and to feel like I'm living a fulfilling and significant life. It's got to be that way. And sometimes like that could just completely distort the actual reality that we're currently experiencing. I mean, for instance, you might think like, hey, if I don't get a good grade on this exam, it's going to ruin me for the rest of my life because I won't get into the school that I want to get into. If I don't get into that school, then I won't get the job. Then nobody will love me. And you imagine this sort of catastrophic cascade. And it makes you sort of relate to the event in a way which clouds what's actually going on. I mean, because the thing that might be happening there is, hey, like there's something I need to attend to here. right? Something that I need to be present to. And if I weren't so caught up in what I think is going to be the meaning of this, I might actually be able to see it for what it actually is, and grow in that way, right? So yeah, no, I really like the view you're laying out there. I think that's right, and I think that's like spot on with what Camus is trying to get across to us here. So I mentioned that Camus is a very political. He was politically active throughout his whole life, and there is a kind of a relationship between how we confront the absurd and the kind of continual revolt that needs to occur in the face of injustice and oppression in the world, right? It would be interesting if you were like a political activist, for instance, and you thought, well, if I just fight this one person, all of the injustice and oppression in the world will be gone. I mean, clearly that's not the case, right? I mean, can we really, I don't know if there's been a moment of human history, maybe in select pockets here and there, where there hasn't been like incredible oppression and suffering and tyranny enacted on ordinary people throughout the world. And there's actually a really, I'm gonna get to the hands raised in just a second. I was watching, no matter what you think about it, I'm not getting into a commentary of the case, it's the whole Kyle Rittenhouse thing, right? And I'm not getting into the details of that, but there was a video of the uncle of Jacob Blake, because he was out there protesting the verdict, and he was with some other activists as well, and they were kneeling down praying, and they were praying for the strength to confront injustice eternally. And I was like, oh, that's exactly Camus' notion of revolt. It doesn't end. It's always going to be that way, and there always is going to be a fight. That's I think a good sort of way of thinking about how Camus wants us to relate to the absurd. Eternal vigilance and eternal confrontation with these circumstances.
Okay. There's a passage in the Plague that's I think very identical to what you were just saying about Camus' view of revolt, where the character, he's a doctor, and he talks about how he's realized that everybody has the plague, and the plague's a bit of a metaphor at this point, and he realizes that the plague can't be eliminated. You can't cure the plague from the world. You just have to try your best to not give it to other people.
Yeah.
To be, I guess, as good of a person you can be in a world that's evil or imperfect.
Yeah, there's this kind of eternal vigilance which has to be maintained in the face of the kind of stark reality that Camus thinks the world is. I mean, the world, unfortunately, in a large respect, is not an entirely pleasant place. And being aware of that is important. So Camus thinks this kind of continual remembrance of sorts, right? Not just dusting off the book once every couple of years, but continually reading within it every morning, every night, is the kind of attitude that he thinks is constitutive of absurd heroism. It's a continual confrontation. So I'm going to just move. So I think we get that concept of revolt. This is Camus' response. This is what he says is how we should respond to absurdity, is with revolt. He also uses the term scorn to describe this. He writes, having started from an anguished awareness of the inhuman, that is the irrational, silent indifference of the universe, the meditation on the absurd returns at the end of its itinerary to the very heart of the passionate flaring of human revolt. So for Camus, the recognition of the absurd brings something out in us. It brings out this passionate flaring of human revolt. this kind of eternal vigilance that we are capable of being present with reality and not succumbing to the comfortable delusions and illusions which make us think that things are a way that they aren't really. So for Camus, revolt is the kind of human condition that he's cultivating, and it is a kind of vigilance in the face of a cold, hard, indifferent universe. And yet at the very same time, this brings out the best in us for Camus. It allows us to be who we are in the most authentic and deepest way that we can. Yeah. So that's his response to the absurd, is to revolt. There's this quote from The Rebel. He's working out the metaphysics of revolt in the beginning of that text, and he uses, this resonance from Descartes. I revolt, therefore we exist. The we there is very interesting, right? So he sees this as a kind of an inherently, I don't know, communal and political act as well, right? Somehow revolting presences the human condition, brings it into being. Yeah, as a collective, but also at the end, because the revolt happens at the level of the individual for Camus, and I think Camus is really, interested in that. He wasn't interested in the kind of collectivism which encourages unthinking obedience to some select set of doctrines, right? He was very much opposed to both authoritarian communism, the kind that was developing in Soviet Russia at the time, but also to fascism, to the authoritarian fascists as well. He saw those as two very similar sort of modes of being, where individual responsibility is given over to the collective. Whereas in his case, right, in the reading of this, it is the individual awareness, right, the individual act of revolt, which constitutes the possibility of a genuine human community, where we can really be present with each other in a more authentic and genuine way. When we're present with each other, when we've let go of our illusions about what is and what ought to be. Yeah. Okay, so let's just move through. There's just a couple of quotes here at the end that I have for us. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent. The lucidity that was to constitute his torture, remember, this condition was supposed to be torture, at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. There, scorn and revolt and rebellion are all synonymous terms here. He writes, I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. I love that. The universe henceforth, without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. So again, I think that's the kind of, hey, presence to reality once the absurd has been recognized. It's not sterile and futile in that moment. You really are with the world, and you're with the world in a way which is not clouded by your own personal prejudices and delusions. He writes, the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. And then finally, all Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein. His silent joy, right? Joy. Sisyphus, joyful. All Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. Likewise, the absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, silences all the idols. In the universe suddenly restored to its silence, the myriad wondering little voices of the earth rise up. Unconscious, secret calls, invitations from all the faces. They are the necessary reverse and price of victory. There is no sun without shadow, and it's essential to know the night. The absurd man says yes, and his effort will henceforth be unceasing. So, a lot to mull over there. I think these passages are actually very deep, and they're hard to sort of encapsulate in any sort of analytical formulation. But I just want to draw your attention to a line here that it's just always really fascinates me what Camus is talking about here when he says, in the universe suddenly restored to its silence. What is that? It's restored. I mean, there's a restoration. Remember, I was saying there's a kind of redemption involved here. So my question to leave for you is, what is this restoration to silence? The world being restored to its silence. And then he says, the myriad wondering little voices of the earth rise up. What's he talking about there? Unconscious secret calls, invitations from all the faces. What's he referring to? What's being restored? What's coming into view once one acknowledges the absurd and affirms its existence and says yes to it? What is becoming present when that happens? So I'm going to leave that just for you to think about. And when we come back after the break, we'll look at Nagel's account of the absurd and see if he provides maybe some deeper insights into the nature of the absurd. And Nagel also has a different way in which he thinks we ought to relate to the absurd. He doesn't think it requires kind of heroism. So go ahead and read through Nagel's piece, get a sense of it, and we'll start talking about this some more when you come back. So have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone. Be safe, travel safe, stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all when we return on Monday.